Tonight we're heading into the misty Alps, where old Swiss towns once told time not with clocks, but with something a bit more agricultural. Picture this: damp stone cottages clinging to steep hillsides, goats staring blankly at nothing in particular, and the metallic clunk of a distant bell echoing through the pines. Except it's not just ringing to say a cow's wandered off. No, that's the town's time signal. That's your alarm clock. And guess what? You're probably already late. Again. These weren't fancy tower bells or grand carillons. Nope. We're talking literal cowbells. Hung on posts, roofs, or sometimes, yes, actual cows. You lived by the clang and died if you ignored it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What's your local time? Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Finished your evening chores, stacking firewood, feeding the hens, chasing your uncle out of the cellar again, and the Alpine chill is already settling in. You shiver under your wool tunic. And then it happens. Clang clong, clang clong. The bell sounds through the valley. Not just any bell. The bell. That sound tells you it's time to head home, lock the door, and definitely not wander into the woods. That's how it's always been here. You see, in these sleepy mountaintop towns, time has never been a tidy string of digital numbers blinking from your phone. For centuries, it was something you heard. Something that clattered and echoed and danced its way through fog and frost. And like most things in old Europe, it started as a matter of survival. Before watches, before clocks, and definitely before Swiss railway timetables ran so punctually they could shame atomic physics, the good folk of the Alps relied on whatever worked. Sundials. Useless on a cloudy day, which, spoiler alert, is most days in the mountains. Church bells. Rare. They were expensive, usually reserved for large towns or monasteries. But cowbells? Ah, those were everywhere. They were large, loud, and often handed down through generations like family heirlooms. Some even had little engravings on them, initials, blessings, maybe a crude drawing of a mountain goat, if the owner was feeling spicy. And the tone? Each bell had its own character. Deep, hollow thuds for older cows. Lighter, higher rings for the younger herd. Swiss villagers, bless their hyper-tuned ears, could often tell which family's livestock had wandered too close to the river just by the sound. Now, the transition from animal accessory to timekeeping instrument wasn't exactly planned. It was more a happy accident. Picture old man Ulrich one chilly evening, standing outside his cheese cellar, ringing his cowbell to call in his family for supper. Neighbor hears it. Thinks, must be about 6. Starts doing the same. Within months, half the town is timing their day by the clatter of Ulrich's bell. Historians still argue whether this kind of informal bell-based timekeeping counts as a protoclock system. Some claim it was nothing more than a social echo chamber with poor acoustics. Others, though, insist it was the earliest form of communal synchronization, a shared sonic schedule created by necessity and held together by trust and echolocation. Of course, the beauty of using cowbells to mark time was also its biggest flaw. Sound travels funny in the mountains. A bell rung on the North Ridge might reach the town square instantly on some days and take 20 echo-bounced seconds on others. You could miss lunch. Or worse, show up to Mass 20 minutes early and have to sit through all the singing. But time was looser back then. Around noon didn't mean 12 p.m. sharp. It meant, when the sun starts peeking through that notch in the cliff and the goats look bored. So even if the bell was a few minutes off, no one was lighting pitchforks. Unless it was way off. Then you might get some very passive-aggressive yodeling from the neighbors. One thing that did help was consistency. Once a family started ringing their bell at a certain hour every day, others adjusted. Some even developed what you might call sonic reputations. Like Frau Gerda, who never missed her 5 p.m. bell for her husband to come in from chopping wood. If he was late, the bell got louder and angrier. Locals joked that if you ever heard a triple clang followed by an eerie silence, it meant Gerda had finally come out with the ladle. And yet, despite the informality, it worked. Somehow. A dozen households clanging out their rhythms, forming an unspoken symphony of survival. A living, breathing timepiece made of metal, weather, and habit. The mountains may not have had minute hands, but they had something better: coordination by cowbell. And the cows? They didn't mind. Honestly, they were probably just happy someone else was finally doing the work for once. But don't get too cozy. Because the simplicity of this system, this bucolic, cowbell utopia, wasn't going to last. People talk. Villages grow. And one morning, someone inevitably thinks, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to rely on cows to tell us when to eat? But that's a story for the next ring of the bell. You wake up, not to the crisp beep of a phone alarm, but to the low, distant dong of a bell somewhere out in the valley. It's not your bell, it's not even your neighbor's bell. But that's the point. That slow ripple of noise crawling up the mountain like steam from a pot. That's how your body knows it's morning. Time to stretch, groan, maybe curse the cold a little and then get up. But let's pause for a second and ask the obvious. What did people even do before they had bells to tell them the time? Turns out, timekeeping in pre-bell, pre-clock, pre-anything rural Switzerland was a bit of an improvisational sport. And you're the lead player. Your first instrument. The sun. Sort of. On a good day when clouds weren't smothering the sky and snow wasn't threatening to crush your thatched roof, you could track the movement of the sun as it scraped across the jagged horizon. If it was high above the peak they called Widow's Tooth, it was midday. If it was casting long shadows behind Old Goat Hill, better start cooking dinner. People relied heavily on natural markers, and every village had their own set of them. A crooked pine tree leaning just so could signal morning. The moment the north cliff stopped reflecting sunlight, that was your cue to head in for supper. And the shadow line from the chimney on the blacksmith's shop, that was your unofficial afternoon tea bell if you were rich enough to afford tea, which you absolutely were not. Of course, these makeshift tools only worked if the sky cooperated. And in Switzerland, well, it rarely did. Some weeks, the sun barely showed up to its own job. That left people fumbling in the fog, making their best guess, or relying on a very scientific method known as yelling across the yard. Picture this: two farmers on opposite ends of a narrow valley, shouting at each other in thick Swiss dialect. Is it time yet? Almost. What? I said almost. Highly accurate. Totally reliable. Historians still argue whether this chaotic shouting routine qualifies as a form of public time coordination or just early morning rage therapy. But yelling had limits. Especially when valleys were steep and voices bounced around like confused ghosts. And sometimes, well, people just forgot. There were always distractions: wandering livestock, sneaky foxes, falling rocks, minor frostbite. Timekeeping wasn't exactly a top priority when your daily schedule revolved around milking, praying, and not dying of exposure. And yet, even without formal devices, there was a rhythm. Days unfolded with the logic of a lived-in habit. You knew when to light the hearth because the wind changed. You knew when to feed the animals because their bellies growled louder than yours. You knew when to call the kids in because the cold began to bite harder. In a weird, lichen-covered way, your body became the clock. Still, the dream of reliable timekeeping lingered in the mist. Eventually, someone got creative. They carved notches into sticks to track hours by candle drip. They hung buckets to collect water, judging time by how full they got. One guy even reportedly tried using the rate of cheese hardening as a timekeeping device. Spoiler, it didn't work. But it did give us what may be the first recorded excuse for being late to dinner. Sorry, the cheese was soft. These people weren't lazy or backward, they were desperately resourceful. Surviving in the Alps was no easy gig. Everything had to pull double duty. Your boots had to work as snowshoes and emergency firewood. Your ox had to haul your cart and plough your field. And your noisemakers. They needed to do something useful, like, say, tell the village what hour it was. Which brings us back to bells. The earliest village bells weren't hung in high towers with golden ropes and solemn rituals. They were rusty, lopsided, and probably smelled like cow. Because they were cowbells. Heavy brass or iron pieces hung around livestock necks. Loud enough to track your herd across a misty hillside, and, as fate would have it, loud enough to tell time if you rang them with purpose. That was the key, intention. 1 clang meant breakfast prep. 2 clangs, midday meal. 3, probably something ceremonial, like a prayer or funeral or a lost goat. Over time, families started using these cues to build out an informal schedule. If Old Man Jacob's bell rang at the same hour every day, folks began syncing up to it. People noticed. They adjusted. And boom, your humble little hillside town now had a rough but functioning sound-based timetable. Was it perfect? No. Was it official? Not remotely. But it worked. And it spread. Neighboring villages picked up the habit. And like any good human invention, it soon spiraled out of control. But before we jump into full-blown bell mania, let's just sit here a minute, in the soft snow outside your wooden cottage, listening to the echoes. One bell fades out. Another picks up. Then another. They don't all match. Some are early, some late. Some ring with a flat, sad kind of tone, like they're tired of being hit every day for 30 years. But you know these bells. You could draw a map just from their voices. There's something weirdly comforting about it, isn't there? The idea that you're not alone. That out there, in the swirling fog, other people are awake, moving, living by the same clangs and chimes you are. Sure, it's not precise. But it's communal. Organic. Human. And yet, humans don't always leave good enough alone. Next, you'll see what happens when these humble bells get institutionalized, when abbeys and officials try to turn this charming chaos into a rigid, punctual empire of sound. Spoiler, the cows are not happy. You're halfway through your bowl of barley porridge when it hits again, clang-clong, clang-clong. Except this one is sharper, more deliberate. Not a random farmer hollering through metal, no. This is structured. Repetitive. Practiced. You squint through the frost-laced window. There, on the crest of the hill, stands a lanky figure in a wool coat, slowly raising and swinging a massive cowbell hung from a timber post like it's some kind of village gong. The rhythm he strikes is oddly soothing, like the heartbeat of the valley itself. And that's no accident. That's your timekeeper. And that bell, it's not just noise anymore. It's a signal. A tool. An early version of your iPhone's alarm, just bulkier, louder, and with significantly more cow involvement. See, somewhere between chaotic neighbor yodels and the dawn of actual mechanical clocks, the Swiss townsfolk found themselves in a strange in-between, a world where time mattered, but timepieces were rare, finicky, and way too expensive. So they leaned on what they had, livestock, metal, and a stubborn determination to make the day run on something other than blind luck. Historians still argue whether the practice truly began in the canton of Uri, or further west in Vaud. What we do know is that by the late Middle Ages, at least a handful of Alpine communities had appointed designated bell ringers, real people with a very serious job, to strike their village bell, often a repurposed cowbell, at precise times throughout the day. Not religious bells. Not town hall clocks. Literal. Cow. Bells. Why? Well, for one thing, they were available. Farmers already owned them. They came in different sizes and tones, meaning villages could pick a bell with just the right pitch, deep enough to carry over hills but not so shrill it woke every goat in a 5-mile radius. Some even tuned the bells, as best they could, by hammering out dents or filing the edges. But the genius wasn't just in using a cowbell, it was in assigning a human to wield it. Imagine being the guy known as the bell. You'd wake early, maybe before sunrise, wrap yourself in a heavy coat, and hike up to a wooden platform or a lookout spot. You'd bring a small bundle of firewood, because nobody likes a cold bell ringer, and you'd wait. And at the right moment, usually guessed through a mix of instinct, sunrise geometry, and whatever your wife screamed at you while handing over a hunk of cheese, you'd strike that bell. 3 slow rings for morning. 1 sharp ring for midday. 5 alternating claps for evening. Each village had its own rhythm, its own pattern. Over time, these patterns became local dialects in the language of sound. If you visited 10 villages in a single valley, you'd hear 10 distinct sonic identities, all based on which bell was struck, how often, and by whom. And that's where things got unexpectedly weird. Not all bells stayed on posts. Some folks took the cowbell idea rather literally. Picture this: a hulking ox, painted with charms, lugging a huge iron bell around its neck, slowly led through the village at dawn. The beast became a walking alarm system. If you heard the bell right outside your door, you knew you were really late. One town in the canton of Obwalden reportedly trained a goat to walk a circular path around the main square with a bell tied to its tail. Not its neck. Its tail. And if that sounds absurd, it's because it was. The goat kept sitting down halfway through the loop, which meant the afternoon bell sometimes never rang. Still, people kept trying. Because once you start living by bells, you can't go back to winging it. Over time, these early timekeeping routines shaped the daily rhythm of life. Children learned to listen for the breakfast bell before going out to gather kindling. Traders waited for the noon ring before opening their store windows. The butcher refused to sharpen his knives before hearing the high-toned soup bell at midday, a sound as Pavlovian as a school lunch whistle. It wasn't all quaint and cozy, though. Some towns took their cowbell timekeeping very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that disputes broke out over whose bell was the official bell. Imagine arguing over whose clonk is more accurate. And yet, that's exactly what happened in a tiny village near Appenzell. 2 families, one on the east slope, one on the west, both rang bells every morning. And naturally, their timings differed by about 10 minutes. Which meant that, depending on which bell you followed, you might show up early to prayer, or scandalously late. The feud lasted for 8 years. It ended when the village mayor made a decisive ruling. Only the east slope bell was to be followed, because it caught the sun sooner. West Side Bell family responded by ringing their bell twice as loud in protest. The mayor allegedly moved out of town. And yet, the whole system, for all its quirks and passive-aggressive echoes, sort of worked. People adjusted their lives around the soundscape. And in a strange twist, they began associating certain emotions with certain bells. That deep, lazy chime that signaled morning chores. Dread. The light, fluttery one that rang just before supper. Pure joy. The triple clang after dusk. Unease, perhaps even superstition. Because bells weren't just telling you when to milk the goats. They were telling you when to feel safe. When to be alert. When to huddle by the fire and not look out the window too long. Some communities even developed bell etiquette. You didn't ring someone else's bell unless you had permission or a death wish. You didn't mock another village's rhythm. And if you were chosen as the bell keeper, you treated that role like royalty. Or at least like being the local postman with a percussion fetish. So, Here you are, sitting on a log in the snow, eating the last bite of dried apple, listening as the familiar bell rings twice. That's your cue. Midday break is over. Time to get back to hauling hay. Or, if you're clever enough, maybe it's time to start asking, what if we made this system just a little more precise? Because just over the ridge, the monks are listening too. And they're about to bring some serious bell game to the valley. The wind bites your cheeks as you make your way uphill, but the sound ahead keeps pulling you forward. A slow, solemn bell, deeper than any you've heard. It doesn't clonk like the cowbells down in the village. It resonates. It feels like it's vibrating in your chest, like someone struck a mountain with a hammer and it's still humming. You round the bend and there it is, the monastery. Built of grey stone and older than anyone can remember, it sits tucked against the cliffs like it's trying to hide from time itself. But hiding's not what these monks do. No, they measure time. They slice it up, divide it, chant through it, and mark it meticulously. And their favorite tool? A bell that makes the village clappers sound like cheap dinnerware. This, dear listener, is where your peaceful little bell-based timekeeping system hits its first upgrade and its first clash. The monks didn't just ring bells for fun. They had rules. Hours, actually. Canonical hours, to be specific. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. 7 of them, spread throughout the day. And if you're wondering how they kept track, well, you guessed it. Bells. Big ones. Monasteries became the first serious time hubs in pre-modern Europe. Their lives were governed by the divine office, a daily cycle of prayers that had to happen at very specific times. And if the sun was unreliable, which it often was, and no one could afford a clock, which no one could, bells filled the gap. Unlike your laid-back village bell guy who guesstimates morning by goat breath and vibes, these monks trained themselves to mark time down to the hour and sometimes the half hour based on astronomical charts, water clocks, and later, mechanical escapements. Yes, the same tech that would power clocks for centuries started showing up in monastery bell towers long before the average peasant even knew what escapement meant. Historians still argue whether these monastic bells were intended as public timekeepers or just for internal discipline. But guess what? Sound doesn't stay inside abbey walls. That deep, rolling bell echoing across hills and valleys quickly became everyone's business. You'd be stacking firewood at home and hear the compline bell. And even though it had nothing to do with you, your body learned to wind down when it rang. After all, if the monks were done for the day, maybe you should be too. But then the problems began. Monasteries were often built just outside towns, usually on elevated ground. Their bells reached farther. They were louder, more regular, and, well, more impressive. Which led to a strange little conflict: monastery bell versus village bell. At first, people welcomed the extra structure. A second opinion on when it was actually noon? Great. But it didn't take long for turf wars to start ringing out, literally. In some places, village bellkeepers started adjusting their chimes to match the monastery, trying to sync up for consistency. In others, they doubled down, ringing earlier or later just to maintain their independence. Imagine having a full-on identity crisis based on which bell you follow. But that's exactly what happened in one 14th century village near Lausanne. They called it the Battle of the Third Ring. The monks rang their midday bell in 3 slow tones. The village, stubborn and proud, responded with 3 short clangs 15 minutes later. Back and forth it went, for months. Farmers were confused. Children were being scolded for coming home early when they were technically on time, depending on which bell you asked. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Both parties would ring at noon, but the village would add a 4th ring, for flavor. No one was happy. Everyone complained. Life moved on. Still, the monks kept ringing. And ringing. And with them came a new concept, time as obedience. For the villagers, time had always been flexible, based on nature and need. For the monks, time was sacred, regimented, precise. Every bell toll meant something. Wake up, pray, eat, work, rest. In many ways, they were turning sound into structure. And this strict structure had a ripple effect. Young men who trained with the monks brought that mentality back home. They'd scoff at the irregular clangs of their village bell and offer to fix the timing. Some even introduced prayer times to their households, mimicking the monastic rhythm. Suddenly, you had average goat herders dividing their day into spiritual intervals, checking the sun's position, and feeling vaguely guilty if they didn't stop to reflect at sext. It wasn't just about knowing the hour anymore. It was about honoring it. That made bells not just timekeepers, but moral compasses. Ringing late, you were spiritually sloppy. Ringing early, suspiciously zealous. But ringing right on time, that was virtue in motion. Even if it meant you were copying the monks down the hill. Eventually, some towns started building their own large bells, not cowbells, not handheld ones, but actual bronze castings with engraved prayers and fancy towers to house them. A clear flex. If the monks could ring out holiness, so could the layfolk. After all, whose time mattered more? God's? Or the guy paying taxes to fix the road? And thus, a kind of sonic rivalry emerged. One that pulsed through the valleys with every hour that passed. It was no longer enough just to keep time, you had to own it. And poor little Barley, the cow with the bell around her neck, just stood in the field and watched as humans argued, prayed, and structured their entire lives around the very thing she once wore to keep from getting lost. Strange how things evolve, isn't it? You rest against the old monastery wall for a moment, letting the chill of the stone seep into your back. The bell rings again, 5 times this hour. For the monks, that means something sacred. For you, it just means supper's probably ready. But deep down, you know it's becoming something more. The next morning, you wake to silence. Not the gentle kind. Not the peaceful, snowy morning kind. No. This is wrong silence. The kind where something should be happening, and it just isn't. No bell. You sit up in your straw-stuffed mattress and stare at the pale light creeping through the shutter slats. Too early? No. You know this light. You feel the hour. Your stomach's already asking where breakfast is. But the air is empty, no clangs, no echoes, no slow monkish toll. Just a kind of sonic vacuum pressing in from all sides. This is what happens when the bell goes missing. And you're not the only one to notice. Step outside and the neighbors are already stirring, faces creased in confusion. Some glance toward the hilltop, where the village's main bell post stands. Others toward the monastery tower. But there's nothing. No sound. Just frost crackling underfoot and a deep, collective unease. Because by now, you've grown used to those sounds. You've internalized the rhythm. When the bells don't ring, your day unspools like an untied bootlace. Meals shift, prayers scatter, chores go unstarted. Even the goats seem thrown off, bleating louder than usual, as if asking, where's the bell guy? Eventually, the truth trickles down through the village grapevine. The bell clappers cracked. A black line right through the center, too fragile to ring. And worse, no spare, no backup. Just a silent hunk of metal hanging on a pole like a dead leaf in the wind. Suddenly, you realize just how dependent you've become on something so deceptively simple. This lump of metal, originally made to track cows, now controls everything. Without it, time feels like soup without salt. Still warm, but not right. And here's where it gets really interesting. You'd think a missing bell would just mean a quiet morning, maybe a few missed appointments. But not in these Swiss towns. Here, A bell going silent meant territory was up for grabs. See, by this point in history, bells didn't just signal hours. They signaled ownership, control, authority. If your bell rang first, you set the tone for the day. Other villages heard your chime echoing across the valley and adjusted accordingly, sometimes out of politeness, sometimes out of fear. So when the bell didn't ring, opportunists pounced. The neighboring village, only half a day's hike away, starts ringing their bell a little louder, a little earlier. Just enough to suggest, hey, since your bell's down, why not follow our time instead? It starts subtly. One or two folks shift their lunch hour to match the foreign bell. A traveling merchant jokes that the timekeeping's better up the road. A few villagers nod a little too long. You can feel the social seams stretch. The village elder, stubborn as the mountain itself, declares, "We keep our own time, bell or not." So he takes it upon himself to stand on the old stump in the square and shout the hour. He's wrong. Frequently. But he's loud. And just like that, a bell becomes a border. Historians still argue whether these bell-based rivalries counted as proto-political power struggles or just mountain-sized egos at work. But there's no denying this. Towns treated bells as flags. Audible flags. If you could hear a bell, you were inside that town's sphere. And if you started obeying that bell instead of your own, well, then maybe your allegiance was shifting, too. Some towns even filed complaints, not to a government, but to the church, accusing rival villages of bell interference. Yes, like radio interference, but with more goats and fewer DJs. There's a record of one town petitioning for exclusive auditory rights to the morning hour, claiming that their bell had historically rung first and any attempts to preempt it were acts of sonic aggression. This sounds ridiculous until you remember these people couldn't afford clocks. Bells were time. Whoever controlled the bell controlled the pace of life. Things reached a fever pitch in the mid-1300s in a cluster of villages along the Reuss River. One community began building a bell tower taller than any other for miles, not for protection, not for faith, but simply to cast their chime further than their rivals. It worked. Their bell rang across 6 settlements. People joked that even the wolves knew what hour it was. The neighboring village responded by crafting a custom low-frequency bell, one that could roll down the hills like thunder, bouncing through valleys in weird, warbling patterns. It wasn't pretty, but it was impossible to ignore. At certain times of day, the echoes overlapped, creating a surreal, out-of-sync duet that made some villagers nauseous. And of course, folks picked sides. You became a low bell person or a high bell person. Families split. Marriages strained. Markets lost coordination. One town even tried to regulate trade hours with a bell passport, a stamped token showing which chime you followed. Yes, bell passports. Because humans, when left alone too long in the Alps, will invent bureaucracy out of anything. The absurdity didn't last forever, of course. Eventually, agreements were made. Territories were defined not just by land, but by audible reach. If your bell was heard here, this field belonged to your town. If it faded before that boulder, that field belonged to someone else. It's one of the strangest chapters in European history, time as territory, sound as sovereignty. All traced back to cowbells and a need to not miss lunch. So now, as you sit under the broken bell, rubbing your hands for warmth, you begin to understand. This isn't just a hunk of metal on a stick. It's history, power, identity, something worth defending. And as the blacksmith hammers out a new clapper in his forge, each strike echoes with something more than noise. It sounds like home. You return to the square the next morning and there he is. Lean, soot-smeared, and wearing the smug expression of a man who has recently rebuilt time itself, the bell ringer. He stands proudly beside the newly repaired bell, cradling the clapper like it's the crown jewel of the village. And honestly, it kind of is. He gives it a test swing, clang, clong, and you swear even the birds freeze for a moment. The sound rings clean, sharper than before. You feel it ripple through the air, bouncing off rooftops, skipping down alleys, threading its way into open windows and still sleeping ears. The town exhales. The rhythm is back. And the man behind the bell? He's now a minor legend. You might think ringing a bell wouldn't be that complicated, just lift, swing, repeat. But in these towns, the role of bell ringer came with a very particular blend of reverence, suspicion, and mild neighborhood celebrity. Some called them stundenmen, or our men. Others, more cheekily, referred to them as Time Lords, not the Doctor Who kind, but not entirely dissimilar either. These folks weren't just marking the hours, they were shaping them. To do the job right, you needed more than muscle. You needed instinct. You needed rhythm. You needed to be able to step outside, sniff the air, squint at the clouds, and know to the minute when to ring that bell. Bell ringers came in many forms. Some were wiry old men with good ears and terrible knees. Others were young upstarts hoping to make a name for themselves through punctual clanging. A few were women, quietly appointed during harsh winters when all the eligible men were away trading, hunting, or inconveniently deceased. Historians still argue whether the position of bell ringer was officially recognized or just something people kind of fell into. One particularly odd theory suggests that some towns used bell ringing as a kind of civic punishment. You stole from the cider shed? Fine. You're in charge of the 5 a.m. bell for the next month. But more often than not, the role was seen as a mark of trust. A responsibility handed down, not taken lightly. After all, a mistimed bell could throw off everything. Miss the morning ring by 10 minutes, and you'd have bakers starting late, milk spoiling, children late to the weaver's hut, and a general sense of unease trailing behind the day like a bad smell. Ring early, and worse, you might wake someone's newborn. Or their husband. Or the town drunk, which was like waking a bear but with more yelling. And let's not forget the ultimate offense, bell hogging. That's when a ringer gets too into the job adding extra flourishes, dragging out the chime, or creating dramatic double rings to show off their bell style. In one infamous case from a town near the Rhone, a bell ringer added an elaborate 5-beat flourish to his evening bell, insisting it made it sound more majestic. The villagers hated it. A group of farmers eventually stormed his post and replaced him with a man known only as Quiet Carl. Still, despite the drama, a good bell ringer was respected. He or she was part timekeeper, part performer, part community glue. You always knew who was ringing by the way they rang. Some had a slow, steady hand. Others brought flair. And some rang like they were swatting at bees, chaotic and a little terrifying. You learned to tell them apart. You even developed preferences. Oh, that's Greta ringing, she's 2 minutes early, but she means well. Hans again. He always rings on the upswing. I hate that. And sometimes, the bell was the person. Families passed down not just the job but the bell itself. It became a kind of inheritance. A symbol of status. The richer families cast their own bells from bronze, engraved with family crests and Latin phrases no one could read. They mounted them on high poles near their farms, and yes, rang them proudly at every meal. This created a fascinating kind of sonic class structure. Bigger bell, richer family, softer chime, probably a farmer, ragged clapper with a rusty tone, probably the guy who keeps his chickens inside during storms. The best bell ringers, though, were those who could adapt. They read the sky for storms. They adjusted their rings for fog, knowing sound didn't travel the same way in damp air. They rang harder when snow was falling and softer when babies were known to be napping. There was even a silent bell ring, a ritual of slowly swinging the bell without letting it strike, to warn of approaching funerals. In some towns, bell ringers doubled as weather forecasters, based solely on how their bell sounded each morning. High pitch, dry day, muffled thud, snow on the way. It wasn't science. But somehow, it usually worked. Of course, the role wasn't without scandal. In one legendary tale passed around central Switzerland, a bell ringer named Lucas began charging neighbors to ring custom times for them, an early lunch bell for the local baker who hated crowds, or a late evening bell for the innkeeper who always overslept. It started as a joke. Then it turned into a business. Then it turned into a riot, when the mayor realized people were living in different time bubbles depending on who they'd paid. Lucas vanished. Some say he fled to Bern. Others say he joined a monastery. But rumor has it, on foggy mornings in the high passes, you can still hear a bell ring, slightly off schedule. Still, for all their quirks and chaos, bell ringers formed the beating heart of their communities. You didn't always see them, but you heard them. Every day. They were your alarm, your clock, your evening signal to put down the shovel and finally sit. And more than once, they were your protector. Because sometimes, a bell wasn't just for time. It was for warning. And when too many bells rang at once, you knew something bad was coming. It starts with a single clang, sharp, fast, too early for any normal hour. Then another. Louder. A second bell joins in, far from the first. Then a third. A fourth. Suddenly the entire valley seems to be ringing, echoing, shouting with steel and brass. You drop what you're holding, some firewood, maybe a ladle, and run outside. Everyone else is doing the same, squinting at the mountains, the forests, the curling smoke rising in the far distance. Something's wrong. You can feel it. Because this isn't timekeeping. This is an alarm. You've heard the rhythm of daily life for so long, the gentle call to breakfast, the midday stretch, the end of work sigh, that when a bell rings off rhythm, it jars your bones. And when every bell in the valley rings like a hammer on steel, you know it's time to run. Welcome to the other half of bell life, danger management. You see, in a world without sirens, cell phones, or emergency broadcast systems, bells were the only way to shout across a mountain. Their reach, their pitch, their bone-deep vibrations, they made them perfect for warning the town. Fire! Ring fast and hard, no rhythm, just pure noise. Raiders! Short double strikes, clang-clang, clang-clang over and over. Missing child! One long, mournful chime, repeated every few minutes. And for avalanches, those sudden, snowy monsters tumbling from cliffs with no warning, you rang everything. Fast. Loud. Non-stop. And you hoped to the Alpine saints that someone further uphill heard it in time. Historians still argue whether these alarm codes were formally written or just passed down by imitation. Most agree it was probably the latter. A village elder might pull the bell ringer aside and say, "Listen, if it's raiders, ring like this." And the bell ringer, being the unofficial therapist and calendar of the town, would nod and remember. In fact, the bell ringer often became a sort of emergency coordinator. Think of them as a cross between a first responder and the town's very loud uncle. When the bell went off pattern, people looked to them first. And here's the thing, people listened. It didn't matter if you were halfway through baking bread or bartering a pig or in the middle of yelling at your spouse, if that bell broke its rhythm, your instincts kicked in. Tools dropped. Voices hushed. Children were grabbed. Paths to higher ground were cleared. And sometimes, just sometimes, a misring caused absolute chaos. There's a record from a small mountain village where a bell ringer's wife went into labor early. In a panic, he ran to the bell and rang it at top speed, trying to get help. Villagers assumed it was a fire. Within 10 minutes, someone had thrown all the hay into the river to protect it, and another man had tried to climb the inn to throw water on the, completely fine, roof. The midwife arrived mid-havoc and shouted, "It's just a baby," to a crowd of people holding buckets and crying. Still, it was better to overreact than underprepare. And bells, with their uncanny way of cutting through fog, storms, and snow, were perfect for getting people moving. Some towns even built redundant bell towers, not for status, but for coverage. One on each edge of the village, like stereo speakers made of stone and wood. If the east tower rang and the west didn't, maybe it was a false alarm. But if both rang, run. Just run. Of course, sometimes the danger was human. Cattle thieves, mercenaries, even the occasional tax collector who, let's be honest, was scarier than both. The bells would ring the intruder rhythm, and men would grab pitchforks, women would gather children, and everyone would rush to the edge of town like a medieval fire drill with more goats involved. And sometimes, the danger wasn't even real. In the spring of 1472, a boy in a village near Freiburg rang the bell to warn of a shadow figure near the woods. Turned out it was a lost donkey wearing a shawl. But the panic that followed, mothers crying, men waving torches, one guy who actually started digging a defensive ditch, was enough to turn the boy into a pariah for a full year. They called him Little Bell and wouldn't let him near the post again. Even churches had to wrestle with this dual identity. Bells were sacred, sure, but they were also civic tools. Some churches blessed their bells, naming them like saints, Clara, Michael, Maria. And when these bells rang the alarm, it was seen as divine warning. God, perhaps, shaking the town awake. Which created yet another layer of pressure for bell ringers. What if you rang wrong? What if you mistimed an alarm, and someone died because of it? What if you didn't ring at all? One infamous case involved a bell ringer who slept through an avalanche warning. By the time he stumbled to the tower, half the valley was already buried. He left the village the next day. Some say he wandered into the forest and became a hermit. Others say he joined a monastery where no one knew his name. But everyone agreed, missing a bell call was the ultimate failure. But in a strange way, these alarm moments bonded towns like nothing else. Because when that bell rang wrong, when it rang wild and fast and frantic, it told everyone, you are not alone. It said, we're in this together. It said, move, now, before it's too late. You could measure a town's history by the scars in its bell, where it cracked from too much ringing, where it was patched after a lightning strike, where initials were carved during long winter nights by a lonely bellkeeper with a knife and a story. And when danger passed, and silence returned, and the only sound left was the slow drip of thawing snow, the bell would ring once. Softly. A reassurance. A reminder that you made it. The bell rings once. Slow, almost bashful. It's the kind of sound that says, it's safe now. You can breathe again. You lean against the stone wall of the bell tower, heart still thumping from the false alarm. Around you, villagers begin drifting back to their homes. One woman clutches her baby tighter, a basket of spilled lentils forgotten at her feet. A shepherd pats the side of his cow like it's a horse he just rode into battle. Even the bell ringer looks sheepish, already accepting the jokes he'll hear at the tavern tonight. And yet, no one's angry. Because every person here knows the truth. Better a needless warning than a silent disaster. This moment, this coming down from chaos into calm, is part of the rhythm too. And now the bell returns to its daily duties. Timekeeping. Meal coordinating. The occasional funeral chime. It slips back into its familiar place like a bookmark into a well-read story. And over the years, as the bell continues to toll, something begins to change, not the sound, but the context. The world is slowly getting louder. Trade routes are expanding. Roads are improving. Horses are galloping further, faster. Merchants, priests, and traveling scholars are passing through towns like migrating birds with too many books. And what are they bringing with them? Clocks. At first, they're oddities, wheeled contraptions with ticking innards and dials that don't quite match the sun. Imported from cities, wrapped in cloth, expensive beyond reason. Most of them don't even keep good time, but they fascinate people. The idea that a machine could do what a bell ringer does, that it could divide the day without wind or instinct or goat-based weather forecasting. You can almost hear the gears grinding in the village elders' heads. Could we use one of those? Should we? Historians still argue whether rural Swiss communities welcomed early clocks or resisted them outright. In some cases, towns pooled resources to buy a shared clock, housing it in the church tower like a jewel. In others, they rejected the devices entirely, trusting the bell more than a mysterious box full of springs and symbols. But slowly, steadily, mechanical time seeps in. You're at the market one day, and someone says, "Meet me at third bell." You agree, as always. But they whisper after you leave, or just after the big hand points up. The first time you hear someone say quarter past, you squint. Past what? Time didn't used to be in relation to anything. Time just was. And yet, there it is, quantified time creeping in. You begin to hear phrases like 10 minutes before supper or 5 after prayers. The bell rings still, but now it competes with a new language. One of precision. One that doesn't echo, it ticks. The bell ringer? He's not replaced. Not yet. But his role becomes conditional, supplementary. People start double-checking his toll against their neighbor's imported clock. If he rings a little early, eyebrows raise. If he rings late, someone points at the tower dial with a smug little ahem. Some bell ringers fight back. They refuse to adjust to the mechanical clocks, claiming they're inaccurate, or foreign, or worse, soulless. One ringer famously declared, "No will tell me when to wake," before hurling a small clock into the river. Others adapt. They sneak up to the clock tower at night, learn how it ticks, then time their rings to match it exactly. The result? Villagers think they're still using the bell ringer's instincts when, in fact, he's now synced to gears. One foot in the old world, one in the new. That's the trick. Still, the power dynamic is shifting. The bell is no longer the only authority on time, it's sharing the job now. And not everyone's happy about it. A merchant, tired of waiting on the unpredictable village bell, installs a private clock outside his shop. He declares it the true noon, complete with a painted sign and 2 wooden hands that he adjusts religiously. The bell rings at its usual time. The merchant's clock is 5 minutes ahead. And thus begins a petty war of timing. Shoppers argue in the street, "It's not noon yet, I heard the bell, but look at the clock. It's past." Clocks lie. Bells feel. Eventually, the village holds a meeting. They try to decide, should the bell follow the clock? Or the clock follow the bell? The vote is split. So they do what any democratic town would do, they ignore it completely. The bell rings when it always has. The clock ticks on. People choose their favorite. Some check both. Others, mostly the elderly, shrug and say, "When the bread's done, it's time." And yet, something deeper is shifting. People begin to think in time. Quantified time. Measurable. Schedulable. You're no longer living in a general rhythm, you're navigating a grid. Appointments get tighter. Tasks get segmented. There's less, "I'll see you after the goats," and more, "Let's meet at 2:30 sharp." The bell becomes a backup, not a centerpiece. Still, the bell doesn't resent this change. It rings on. It always has. And sometimes, in the midst of this ticking world, you still hear its tone break through the fog. A single chime. Not for danger. Not even for a meal. Just a reminder, hey, I'm still here. Time, after all, isn't just about precision. It's about presence. And no matter how many gears you install, No matter how accurate the dials become, nothing feels quite like hearing your own village's bell. It belongs to you. And the next chapter? Oh, it's coming. Because if clocks changed the meaning of time, wait till the railways arrive. You're halfway through loading hay into the barn when the entire ground seems to vibrate. Not from an avalanche. Not from thunder. From something far stranger, a machine. It shrieks in the distance, a metallic screech you've never heard before, followed by a deep, steady chugging, like a monstrous forge come to life. You drop the hay. Everyone does. Even the goats freeze mid-chew. And just over the ridge, a trail of steam slithers into the sky like a ghost. The train has arrived. And with it, a new time beast altogether. You see, before the railways, time had a local flavor. One village might be 10 minutes ahead of the next. No one really cared. The sun told you when to eat, the bell told you when to work, and your stomach told you everything else. If someone asked what time it was, the honest answer was usually nowish. But trains didn't run on ish. They ran on schedules. Precise. Coordinated. Ruthlessly uniform. So when Switzerland began threading its valleys and mountain passes with iron rails in the mid-1800s, every town's sense of time had to undergo a violent adjustment. Because suddenly, it mattered if your noon bell was 7 minutes behind the next villages. If passengers showed up late, they missed the train. If goods weren't loaded by 2:12 p.m. exactly, they sat idle until tomorrow. If two trains tried to share a track at the same time, well, that was more collision than commute. So the federal government did something previously unthinkable. They introduced standardized time. Historians still argue whether this was the moment Swiss timekeeping truly became legendary, or whether it was just the moment everything got a lot more annoying. Either way, the edict was clear. From now on, everyone would run on Swiss railway time. Not your bell. Not your instincts. Not the monks. The trains. Imagine what that felt like. One morning you're sipping warm goat's milk, listening for your usual bell chime, and the next there's a government-issued clock nailed to the station wall, declaring with cold certainty, it is 6:47 a.m., and no, we will not be rounding. Some villagers fought back. They clung to their bells like anchors in a storm, insisting that railway time was fine for the city folk, but real people still listened to the metal voice in the tower. Others folded quickly, installing shiny brass clocks in shop windows and adjusting their daily rhythms to match the stationmaster's charts. A few even tried to sync the village bell to the railway schedule, ringing on the quarter hour like human cuckoo clocks. It didn't go well. There's a story from a tiny hamlet near Lucerne where the bell ringer attempted to chime every arriving and departing train. Within 3 days, he lost his voice, injured his shoulder, and was found muttering train numbers in his sleep. He retired. The town went back to 2 chimes a day. But the psychological shift had begun. Time was no longer a local agreement. It was a national law. And that law traveled not by echo, but by telegraph wire. Yes, while bells had once been the fastest sound in town, now they were being outrun by dots and dashes zipping through copper lines. Messages sent from Bern to Basel in seconds. Timetables updated in real time. Conductors checking pocket watches not by the sun or the bell, but by a master clock in Zurich. The bell became quaint. Still respected, but no longer obeyed. Like your wise but retired uncle, offering advice from his porch while the trains thunder by in the distance. And yet, people missed it. The feeling of it. The emotional anchor. Because railway clocks were precise, but they didn't care if your baby was asleep. They didn't carry the scent of moss and rain and wood smoke. They didn't echo differently in winter than they did in spring. The bell had mood. The clock just had minutes. And so, in a move that surprised everyone, some villages made the bold choice to preserve both. They rang the bell according to old local time out of tradition, respect, and just to feel grounded, but they scheduled trains and markets by the railway clock. This led to some hilarious conversations. When does the market open? 10 after the bell. Which bell? The noon bell, which rings at 12:07 by the railway clock, so technically 12:17 bell adjusted, but really closer to 12:04 in the summer if Greta's ringing it. Even the goats were confused. Still, it worked. Because the Swiss, if nothing else, love a good compromise. And so two systems coexisted, emotional time and efficient time. The bell was for your heart. The clock was for your schedule. You could live with both as long as you didn't miss the train. There were even brief periods of bell rebellion, where a few especially crusty bell ringers refused to change, ringing defiantly off sync from the national time in protest. Some towns let them. Some didn't. And some just gave them honorary titles, let them ring whatever they wanted, and quietly ignored it. Because by now, everyone understood something. The bell wasn't really about accuracy anymore. It was about identity. It was about remembering a time when a single chime could tell an entire valley that the day had begun, that the cows needed milking, and that the soup was almost ready. And maybe, just maybe, that sound was still worth waking up to. Even if the train left 5 minutes ago. By now, you've learned to live with both. The bell still rings, soft, familiar, forgiving. And the railway clock still ticks, precise, unbothered, always a little smug. You move between them like a person with dual citizenship. A foot in the old world, a foot in the new. But just when you think things have settled, another visitor arrives in the village. He's wearing a vest too fine for a farmer and carrying a satchel full of gears and springs. His name is something like Herr Koppenschmidt. But everyone just calls him the clock man. He's not here to tell time. He's here to install it. You see, even though mechanical clocks had been slowly creeping into Swiss towns for over a century, they were still, in most places, luxuries. Delicate, finicky, expensive. Until now. What's changed? Mass production. Suddenly, a modest village like yours can afford not one, not two, but several reliable clocks. Some hang outside shops, some get mounted on towers, and one bold mayor even installs one in his own kitchen, declaring, proudly, "Now I always know when to yell at my children." You watch as the clock man installs a gleaming timepiece above the town square. It's grand. It's imported. It ticks like it means it. And then, quietly, the bell gets moved. Not silenced, heaven forbid, but repositioned. Its rope shortened. Its tower partially decommissioned. You look up one morning and realize it's only ringing twice a day now. Just morning and evening. The important hours, they say. The rest. That's the clock's job. And it is helpful. You have to admit it. Shops open together now. Deliveries actually show up on time. The baker doesn't just wing it, he schedules. The weaver no longer guesses when her thread's done soaking, she times it. Even the goats are milked at precise intervals, thanks to a new device called a cow timer, don't ask. But something about it feels clinical. The days, once wide and woolly, now have edges. Boundaries. Sharp little tick marks dividing the hours like fences in a pasture. Time is no longer a rhythm you feel, it's a number you obey. Historians still argue whether this transformation was progress or loss. Was the clock a gift? A shackle? An upgrade? A betrayal? Probably all of the above. But one thing's for certain, the bell begins to fade. You hear it less. You notice it less. Until one day, you realize the bell hasn't rung in 3 whole afternoons, and nobody even mentioned it. Not even you. There's something quietly tragic in that. Like forgetting the name of a childhood friend. But not everyone gives in so easily. In a sleepy corner of your village, An older woman named Lenny still rings a smaller bell from her porch. It's not connected to any schedule. It doesn't match the tower. She just rings it when she feels the time is right. Before supper. When the clouds change. When the cat comes home. Some folks roll their eyes. Others smile. A few start timing their dinner to Lenny's bell instead of the clock. They call it the gut hour. Because Lenny's always right, even when she's not. And in that, the bell finds its second life. It becomes ceremonial. No longer the boss of the town's schedule, but still its soul. The bell rings for weddings. For funerals. For holidays. For the first snow. For when the mayor's cow gives birth to twins and everyone just wants an excuse to cheer. It rings to remember. To mark. To connect. It even becomes musical. Teenagers start composing bell chimes in secret, adding little syncopations or harmonic echoes. One of them convinces the blacksmith to forge a smaller bell tuned to a different pitch. For a few glorious months, the village has dueling bells, ringing in harmony. It's beautiful. And very confusing. Eventually, the tradition settles. The tower bell rings twice a day. Lenny's porch bell rings whenever she pleases. And the old cowbell? It's nailed above the tavern door, tarnished and beloved. People touch it for luck on their way in, then forget entirely what time it is. Because sometimes, time isn't about the hour. It's about the feeling. And the bell? It's not just an alarm or a signal or a warning. It's a heartbeat. An audible thread that ties you to the land, the people, and the hundreds of years you didn't live through but somehow still belong to. So the clock keeps ticking. But the bell keeps ringing. Quiet now. Fewer times. But when it rings, you hear it deep in your ribs. And you smile. Because no matter how many clocks you own, you'll always be a bell person. It's early. Not quite dawn, not quite dark. The sky hangs in that washed-out grey where time seems to pause between heartbeats. And just as you lace up your boots, clang. There it is again. That one steady, confident ring from the tower bell. Not rushed. Not flashy. Just present. A reminder that no matter what century this is, no matter what the schedule says, the village still begins its day with a sound you can feel in your bones. And just like that, you're part of a ritual that's lasted hundreds of years. You nod to the bell tower as you pass it, half out of habit, half out of gratitude. Because even now, especially now, there's something grounding about hearing a bell that hasn't changed, even when everything else has. But the modern world waits for no chime. By the time you reach the market road, you've passed 3 clocks, one on the bakery, one in the post office, and one digital display built into the side of the new electric bus stop. All different times. You'd think we'd have it figured out by now. That's the funny part. Switzerland, a country famous for its obsessive precision, still has villages where the bell says one time, the shop says another, and the train swears it's on schedule but is absolutely, definitely late. And that's because there are too many clocks now. Wall clocks. Wristwatches. Phones. Smartwatches. Microwaves. Fitness bands. All ticking. All slightly out of sync. The old joke goes, a man with 1 clock always knows the time. A man with 3 is never quite sure. And in this age of satellites and nanoseconds, the bell becomes a kind of anti-clock. It's imprecise on purpose. It doesn't care about milliseconds or countdowns or synced calendars. It cares about meaning. It says, right now matters. You're here. You're alive. You're in this moment. Historians still argue whether this shift toward experience over precision was the bell's intended legacy or just a lucky accident. Either way, the bell has adapted by refusing to compete. It no longer plays the timekeeping game. It plays the memory game. Because the bells in these towns are now deeply tied to communal identity. In the village where you grew up, You remember the exact tone of your morning bell. A slightly flat G note, softened by years of weather and just a hint of rust. It wasn't impressive, but it was yours. It meant school was starting, or bread was ready, or church was about to begin even though nobody really wanted to go. That bell tone was home. And when you move to a city, a place with glass towers and lead signs and clocks on every street, you feel something missing. Something unmeasurable. A kind of silence you didn't notice until it wasn't filled by a low, lazy dong from a tower you knew by heart. So you go back. Not to live, maybe, but to visit. To walk the cobbled streets. To breathe that pine-thick air. And yes, to hear the bell ring again. Just once. Because that sound isn't just for the living. In many towns, the bell rings for the dead too. It's called the Totenglock, the death bell. One long toll, followed by a short silence, then another. It's not sad, exactly. It's not scary. It's just solemn. A sound that wraps the village in acknowledgement. Someone has passed. Someone who once listened to this same bell at breakfast, at prayer, at the first snow. Some towns even have different chimes depending on whether the deceased was male or female. Others add a special ring for elders, or veterans, or long-time bell ringers themselves. In one village, when their bellkeeper passed after 62 years of service, the townsfolk rang the bell for 62 minutes straight. No words. Just that deep, resonant voice, rolling across the hills like smoke. It was one of the quietest funerals anyone ever attended. And people still talk about it. Because that's what the bell does now. It marks the emotional moments. It chimes at weddings, not to say you're married now, but to say everyone hears this. Everyone knows you're beginning something. It rings at festivals, when bonfires are lit and lanterns float like jellyfish across the lake. It even rings for the cows still, during Alpabfahrt, when they return from their summer pastures, bedecked in flowers and clanging brass. Yes, the cows get their moment too. Because if there's anything Switzerland knows, it's this: bells and belonging go hand in hand. And in the strangest twist of all, some cities, once too modern for bells, are bringing them back. Digital towers now house reprogrammed carillons that simulate old bell tones. Town squares install tiny memory bells that chime hourly for the elderly residents who say the city's gotten too quiet. In a park in Zurich, there's a sculpture made entirely of salvaged bell clappers. It doesn't make a sound, but people come to touch it. To feel the past vibrate under their fingers. So even as the world ticks faster and faster, the bell waits. It doesn't chase the future. It rings when it's needed. It listens when it's not. And every now and then, when you least expect it, you hear it again. A single, patient note. Calling you back to the present. The sky is lavender now, one of those sleepy evenings where the clouds look like someone smudged them with a charcoal thumb. You're on a bench, somewhere just uphill from the village square. The kind of spot where time slows without asking permission. And right on cue, the bell rings. Not loud. Not urgent. Just true. The sound folds into the landscape. It skips across the slanted rooftops, drifts through kitchen windows, swirls gently over the lake like a mist you can hear. Someone in town puts down their knife mid-chop. A child closes a book. A dog perks its ears. No one speaks. No one needs to. This is the evening bell, and it's not here to inform you. It's here to remind you that the day is yours. You've done what you could. The rest can wait. It's a ritual that's outlived revolutions, war, electricity, refrigeration, satellite maps, and TikTok. And somehow it still works. Still matters. Because the bell doesn't just divide time anymore. It protects it. You start to notice it, how the bell insists on creating space. You could call it mindfulness, but that would be too modern a word. It's more like the town whispering, It's okay to stop now. You're allowed to stop. People in this village respect that whisper. You'll still see someone closing up shop a full hour before sunset. Not because they have to, but because the bell rang. That's reason enough. The butcher's sharpening knives. Bell rang. Stop. The carpenter halfway through a plank. Bell rang. That's tomorrow's problem. You, too, find yourself shifting your pace. Not because the bell commands it, but because it offers it. A new tempo. One that listens instead of lectures. And yes, clocks are still everywhere. You still glance at your phone. But something has changed inside you. The bell now speaks to a part of your mind that doesn't care about numbers. It speaks in mood, in tone, in the kind of presence you can't schedule into a calendar. Historians still argue whether this use of bells as emotional metronomes was intentional or just a side effect of nostalgia. Some claim communities structured their whole emotional memory around chimes. Others say the bell is just a habit dressed up as meaning. But you know better. Because you feel it. You feel it most when it's missing. A week ago, the tower bell broke. Rust in the pivot. Nothing tragic, but enough to stop the swing. No one mentioned it right away, Swiss politeness. Maybe, but you could sense the unease. People lingered longer in the square, waiting for a sound that didn't come. One boy asked his mother if the town was sick. It took 3 days to fix. When the first ring returned, sharp and triumphant, the baker cried. You didn't mean to, but you clapped. Everyone did. That's the thing with ritual. You don't realize how deep it goes until it slips. And the bell isn't the only one. You start to notice other sounds trying to do what it once did. A church carillon piping out familiar melodies every quarter hour. A distant school bell clanging students into submission. The sound your dishwasher makes when it finishes, some high-pitched mimic of accomplishment. But none of it hits the same. Because the bell isn't mechanical. It's lived in. It has weight. You can hear the decades in its tone, the soot in its breath. You can smell its echo if the wind's right, part iron, part mountain air, part goat. And there's something else. Something the clocks never figured out. The bell makes room for silence. That moment after it stops ringing. That breathless hush. It's sacred. It's the town exhaling. It's you realizing you've been rushing all day for no reason at all. It's a kind of collective stillness you didn't know you needed. And some people crave that silence so much, they ring their own bells, not loud, not public, just tiny ones. A pendant bell on a bedroom shelf. A chime on a balcony. A soft strike before sleep. It's not about the time. It's about the pause. A little exhale between thoughts. Between moments. Between the 1,000 things that clutter a modern mind. And now you understand. The bell isn't just old tech clinging to relevance. It's not a nostalgia machine. It's a recalibration tool. A sonic boundary between chaos and calm. Between the outside world and your own heartbeat. Even when you can't hear it, you carry its rhythm in your chest. Clang, silence, breathe. Clang, stillness, rest. Because that's the real genius of this whole thing. You don't need to chase the bell anymore. You've already become it. You're in a modern city now, maybe Geneva, maybe Zurich, and everything is glass, chrome, and hum. The streets don't creak like village cobbles. They purr. Cars glide past on near-silent motors. People tap their wrists, swipe screens, glance up at LED panels without ever breaking stride. The flow is seamless. The rhythm is relentless. And yet, you pause. Because up ahead, rising out of the tangle of tram wires and cafe umbrellas, is something wrong. Out of place. Old. It's a bell tower. Not digital. Not ironic. Just standing there, stone, wood, brass and humming quietly through the air like a mountain memory that refuses to retire. You smile. Because you weren't expecting it. But now that you see it, you realize, of course it's here. Switzerland never fully let them go. That's the quiet truth. Even the most modern places, those packed with synchronized elevators and satellite-synced clocks, have kept at least one bell. Maybe out of respect. Maybe superstition. Maybe no one had the nerve to tell it to stop. You approach the tower, stepping off the flow of the sidewalk crowd, and listen. Nothing yet. But there's a plaque near the base. Worn lettering. It reads, "This bell has rung through plague, fire, and peace. If you hear it, you are not alone." And that's what it is, really. The bell is proof of presence. Proof that someone still marks time together. Because in the city, time becomes solitary. You watch it on screens. You live it through alerts. You feel it in your stress levels. But you rarely share it with strangers. The bell changes that. It chimes, and everyone hears it at once. Rich, poor, busy, bored, lost in thought, halfway to a bad decision. Doesn't matter. For a brief moment, you're all synchronized. Not mechanically, emotionally. You stand in the square. It's lunchtime. And just as your phone vibrates with a bland 12 o'clock, the bell rings. It's different here. Sharper. Less forgiving than your village bell. But still full-bodied, still honest. It cuts through the concrete and glass and espresso foam. It insists on being noticed. And for a second, just a second, the city pauses. A man in a suit stops texting. A child looks up. A barista finishes frothing milk and smiles at no one in particular. It passes quickly. The bell fades. The flow resumes. But you're left with a tiny echo in your ribs. A kind of sonic fingerprint. Proof that someone rang it, someone heard it, and now you're part of that loop. Historians still argue whether this lingering respect for bells is cultural memory or deliberate design. Some say the Swiss simply never stopped valuing collective time. Others claim it's all aesthetics, charming acoustics in tourist districts. But talk to anyone who grew up near a real working bell, and you'll hear something else. It just doesn't feel like home without it. And cities have begun to listen. New buildings are incorporating digital bells, not recordings, but fully functional carillons, tuned to sound old, controlled by software, installed in modern towers. Some play melodies. Some stick to simple tolls. A few even let residents vote on the chime pattern. There's a university in Lausanne that built a bell simulator. It lets students test different tones for different spaces. One student made a bell that only rings when the air quality hits a certain level. Another linked it to stock market fluctuations. No one liked that one, it rang way too often. But even the strangest new bells still honor the central truth. People like to know that time is being kept with them. Not just for them. Not around them. With them. And bells, somehow, still do that better than anything. You wander further. Find another bell. This one's smaller, tucked under an awning outside a bookstore. There's a handwritten sign above it. Ring once for luck. Twice for love. 3 times and the shopkeeper gives you a dirty look. You ring once. Just because. A passing stranger grins at you. You grin back. Time shared. Even that tiny moment, goofy, pointless, spontaneous, feels real. Because the bell, even now, connects. It doesn't just mark the hour. It marks you in that hour. A heartbeat wrapped in brass. A ritual you didn't know you missed. And now, just like that, the city feels different. Not slower. Not quieter. Just more human. All because something ancient rang loud enough to remind you. You're still part of the village. Even here. It's nighttime again. And this time, The darkness feels familiar. Not because of the absence of light, but because of the presence of stillness. That rare, hum-softened quiet that settles over towns after dinner, after dishes, after stories are told and lights begin to wink out one by one. And just when you think the day is over, the bell rings. Softly. One long, low tone. Not because anything has happened. Not because anything is coming. But because it always does. The night bell. It's not a warning. Not a command. It's a ritual tucked into velvet. A lullaby written in iron and air. You listen. You're not alone. Even now, when most people are glued to blue screens or lulled by streaming noise, the bell still works. Not as a timer. As a tether. Because somewhere, someone else hears it too. A farmer folding his coat on a stool. A baker checking his dough for tomorrow's rise. A schoolteacher writing one last note in a margin. And for a moment, you're all tied together by that same vibration. And isn't that wild? That something invented to keep cows from wandering, evolved into a national heartbeat. Historians still argue whether Swiss timekeeping's legendary precision began with the cowbell, the church bell, or the railway clock. But everyone agrees, the rhythm started here. In these valleys. In these towers. In these little moments when a chime meant something even if no one could quite say what. And now, long after the bells stopped telling people what to do, they still mean things. Things clocks can't say. Clocks are logical. Bells are emotional. Clocks say, it's 9:30. Start working. Bells say, it's now. You're here. Pay attention. And people have begun to notice the difference. In fact, there's a new movement emerging. Small, gentle, and almost poetic, resonant timekeeping. The idea is simple. You don't divide the day by numbers. You divide it by sound. Morning isn't 6 a.m., it's when the east-facing bell rings twice through mist. Lunch isn't noon, it's the high, warm peal that echoes over the bakery at the sun's apex. Evening isn't 7 p.m., it's the low bell that sighs just before the stars show up. Some communities are experimenting with it formally, installing bell networks, using acoustics instead of alarms. A town in Appenzell recently asked its residents what sound made them feel most in time. The winning answer: my grandfather's old cowbell, rung once, from the kitchen hook. So now, in that town, every day at 4 p.m., a recording of that exact cowbell plays in the town square. And people stop. Not because they have to. Because they want to. Because something inside them remembers. Not the sound exactly, but what it did to their breath. Their pace. Their sense of belonging. You think of Lenny back in your village. Still ringing her porch bell, even though no one asked her to. Maybe especially because no one asked her to. You wonder who's hearing it tonight. Maybe no one. Maybe someone who didn't even realize they needed to. Because the bell isn't about attention, it's about invitation. An open door in sound form. Come in. Breathe slower. Be here. The tech companies haven't figured out how to monetize that yet. There's no app that can compete with ding, pause, hush. And maybe that's the point. The bell reminds you that you don't always have to be reminded. You can just be. It's okay if you don't reply immediately. It's okay if you pause mid-thought. It's okay if your tea goes cold because you were watching the light curve over the ridge. You're not falling behind. You're syncing with something deeper. And in the quiet, you begin to hear all the other bells, not physically, but in memory. The layers of centuries. The wedding bells, the storm bells, the playful cowbells, the bells that rang for 1,000 little reasons no one wrote down. And now, you realize, every single one of them is still echoing. Inside you. You're lying in bed now. Somewhere safe. Somewhere quiet. A thin breeze curls through the window, stirring the curtains like slow breath. Your eyes are heavy, not just from the day, but from the long arc of history you've traveled. And still, the bell waits. You think about that first ring, back when villagers tied cowbells to their livestock, not because they wanted to mark time, but because they wanted to keep things close. To know where the herd was. To know the rhythm of life and land and labor. It was about safety. Then it became order. The church bell calling people to prayer. The watch bell warning of danger. The midday bell giving the green light to put down your tools and pick up your spoon. Time wasn't a concept, it was a soundtrack. And somehow, in spite of every invention since quartz crystals, atomic clocks, hyperloop predictions, digital wristbands that measure your heart rate and guilt trip you into walking more, the bell remains. Not by accident. By something deeper. Something like refusal. You see, the bell refuses to be optimized. You can't speed it up. You can't swipe it away. You can't mute it without muting everything it stands for. It's the opposite of hustle. It's the voice that says, "Hey, nothing is burning. You can breathe." It doesn't ask anything of you. Not like your phone. Not like your inbox. Not like that relentless scroll of content that never lets your brain sit still. The bell. It gives you permission to stop. And what a gift that is. Historians still argue whether modern Switzerland's obsession with time came from the train schedules, the watchmakers, or something older. But maybe it wasn't about precision at all. Maybe it was about protection. About holding on to something true, even as the world sped up. Because now you know what the bell really is. It's not a relic. It's a spell. A daily incantation reminding us we are more than our calendars. That we are allowed to mark moments not just by what we accomplish, but by what we feel. You roll to one side, the sheets wrapping around you like a hillside. Outside, the village sleeps. The city hums. The stars are in their usual places, which is always strangely comforting. And just as you're about to drift, you hear it. One final ring. Not a loud one. Not even from a tower. Maybe it's just your neighbor's wind chime, nudged by a lazy gust. Or Lenny, tapping her old porch bell because she's feeling generous. Or maybe, just maybe, it's your own memory, looping back one more time before the night takes over. Whatever it is, it's enough. You smile into the dark. Because that sound, that's the world saying, good night.